The spring of 1882 brought nothing but misfortune to Madeline Nash as she stood shivering in the doorway of the ramshackle stable, her threadbare shawl offering little protection against the bitter Wyoming night. Just 3 months a widow, with nothing but the clothes on her back and her late husband's pocket watch, she had traveled west on promises that turned to dust upon arrival. Now, as the ranch owner's wife glared at her with undisguised contempt, Madeline realized how desperately alone she truly was. "You can sleep with the horses until you earn your keep," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice as cold as the wind that whipped around them. "My husband may have hired you out of pity, but I won't have some strange woman in my house." The stable door slammed shut, leaving Madeline in near darkness. She sank down onto a pile of hay, her legs finally giving way after the long journey from Boston. The tears she'd been holding back for weeks flowed freely now, mingling with the dust on her cheeks. Her husband Thomas had been dead barely 3 months, pneumonia taking him swiftly and leaving her with nothing but debts. His gambling had stripped them of everything, forcing her to answer an advertisement for a housekeeper position out west. The sound of horses shuffling in their stalls reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve and tried to make herself as comfortable as possible on the hay. Tomorrow would be different, she told herself. Tomorrow she would prove her worth. The creak of the stable door startled her awake. Madeline sat up, disoriented, hay clinging to her dark hair. Dawn had not yet broken, but a lantern cast a warm glow over the figure of a tall man standing in the doorway. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but she could make out a strong jaw covered in stubble. "Madam." His voice was deep but gentle. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" Madeline scrambled to her feet, brushing hay from her skirts. I'm the new housekeeper." "Mrs. Thornton said I should stay here until what?" "The horses complained about the company." The man shook his head in disbelief. He stepped further into the stable, and the lantern light revealed a face weathered by sun and wind, but kind. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, regarded her with concern. "Lucas Prescott," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I run this ranch alongside Mr. Thornton." "Madeline Nash," she replied, trying to maintain some dignity despite her disheveled appearance. Lucas's expression darkened. "Did Albert know his wife put you out here?" "I don't believe so. I arrived late yesterday evening, and he'd already retired." Lucas muttered something under his breath that Madeline suspected wasn't meant for a lady's ears. He set the lantern down and removed his coat, holding it out to her. "Put this on. You're coming with me." "But Mrs. Thornton doesn't own this ranch. Come on now before you catch your death." Too cold and tired to argue, Madeline accepted the coat, which enveloped her in warmth that smelled of leather and pine. Lucas picked up her small valise and led her across the yard toward the main house. The sky was just beginning to lighten, promising a clear day ahead. As they approached the back door, Madeline hesitated. "I don't want to cause trouble, Mr. Prescott." Lucas turned to her, his expression softening. "It's no trouble at all, Mrs. Nash, and please call me Lucas." He opened the door and gestured for her to enter. "This is your home, too." The kitchen was warm, the embers in the stove still glowing from the night before. Lucas added wood and stoked the fire until flames danced behind the iron grate. He filled a kettle with water and set it to boil before turning back to Madeline, who stood awkwardly by the door, still wrapped in his coat. "Sit down, please," he said, pulling out a chair at the wooden table. "You must be exhausted." Madeline sank gratefully into the chair. "Thank you, your kindness is unexpected." "It's not kindness, Mrs. Nash. It's common decency." His jaw tightened. "Something the Thorntons occasionally forget." "Please call me Madeline," she said, slowly removing his coat and hanging it on the back of her chair. "Mrs. Nash reminds me of your husband," Lucas finished for her. "I understand. The advertisement mentioned you were widowed. I'm sorry for your loss." Madeline nodded, unable to explain that her grief was complicated by the bitter truth of her marriage. Thomas had been charming but irresponsible, leaving her with nothing but memories of broken promises. The kettle whistled, and Lucas prepared 2 cups of coffee, setting one before her. "There's milk and sugar if you'd like. Black is fine, thank you." She wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. Lucas sat across from her, studying her face in the growing light. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her mid-20s, with striking features despite the exhaustion evident in her dark eyes. "The position comes with proper lodging," he said. "There's a small room off the kitchen meant for the housekeeper. It's modest but comfortable." Mrs. Thornton seemed to think differently. Lucas's expression hardened again. "Vivian Thornton has her own ideas about how things should be run, but Albert and I are partners in this ranch, and I have equal say in these matters." He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. "Albert's father and mine built this place together. When they passed, we inherited it jointly. The Rocking Pea has been home to Prescotts and Thorntons for 3 generations. And Mrs. Thornton resents that," Madeline guessed. A small smile tugged at Lucas's lips. "You're perceptive." "Yes, Vivian would prefer Albert owned everything outright. She's from back east, used to a different kind of life." "I'm from Boston myself," Madeline offered, "but circumstances change." "That they do." Lucas regarded her thoughtfully. "What brought you all the way out here, if you don't mind my asking?" Madeline stared into her coffee, debating how much to reveal. "After my husband died, I discovered we were deeply in debt. The house, the furniture, even my jewelry, everything had to be sold to pay what he owed. I needed a fresh start, somewhere far away. And you chose Wyoming territory." There was a note of surprise in his voice. "The advertisement offered good wages and mentioned a piano. I was a music teacher before I married." She smiled faintly. "I thought perhaps I might be allowed to play occasionally." "The piano was my mother's," Lucas said. "It sits largely unused in the parlor. You're welcome to it any time." The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted their conversation. Moments later, a sleepy-eyed man in his 40s entered the kitchen, his graying hair disheveled from sleep. "Lucas, you're up early." His gaze fell on Madeline, and confusion crossed his face. "Oh, you must be Mrs. Nash. I didn't expect to see you until breakfast." Before Madeline could respond, Lucas spoke, his tone deceptively casual. "Mrs. Nash arrived last night while you were asleep, Albert. Seems your wife decided the stable was appropriate accommodation for our new housekeeper." Albert Thornton's face reddened. "The stable? Good Lord." He turned to Madeline. "I apologize, Mrs. Nash. That was never the arrangement." "It's quite all right, Mr. Thornton. Mr. Prescott has been very kind. Still, it's unacceptable. I'll speak to Vivian." Lucas stood, refilling his coffee cup. "I've already told Mrs. Nash about the housekeeper's quarters. She'll be moving in there today." Albert nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Of course. That's what we agreed upon in our correspondence." He attempted a welcoming smile. "We're pleased to have you here, Mrs. Nash. The house has needed a proper housekeeper since Mrs. Miller left to care for her ailing mother." "I'm grateful for the opportunity," Madeline replied, though her confidence in the position had been somewhat shaken by her reception. "I'll help Mrs. Nash get settled," Lucas said. "The hands will be expecting breakfast soon." Albert glanced at the clock on the wall. "Yes, you're right. I should get dressed and see to the north pasture. We've got fence repairs scheduled today." He nodded politely to Madeline before leaving the kitchen, Once he was gone, Lucas sighed. Albert's a good man, but he lets Vivian have her way too often. They seem mismatched. That's putting it kindly. Albert was smitten with her fine manners and pretty face when they met during his trip to Denver 5 years ago. He didn't realize she expected a mansion and servants, not a working ranch in Wyoming. Madeline could understand Vivian's disappointment to some extent. She, too, had once harbored dreams of a comfortable life, only to have them dashed by reality. But she would never have treated another person with such cruelty. "Come on," Lucas said, rising from the table. "Let me show you to your room before the house wakes up." He led her through the kitchen to a small door she hadn't noticed before. Beyond it was a modest but clean room containing a narrow bed, a washstand with a mirror above it, and a small chest of drawers. A window overlooked the kitchen garden, now dormant in the early spring. "It's perfect," Madeline said honestly, setting her valise on the bed. After spending the night in a stable, this room seemed like luxury. "There's a key in the drawer if you want privacy," Lucas told her. "The door locks from inside." The implication wasn't lost on Madeline. Lucas was ensuring she felt safe, even from members of the household. "Thank you," she said, meeting his gaze directly, "for everything." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Then Lucas cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should let you get settled. The hands will be in for breakfast at 6. There are supplies in the pantry and the stove's already warm." "I'll manage," Madeline assured him. After Lucas left, she sat on the edge of the bed, taking a moment to absorb the rapid change in her circumstances. Just an hour ago, she'd been huddled in a stable, despairing of her future. Now she had a room, albeit a small one, and at least one ally in this strange new place. She unpacked her few belongings quickly. 3 dresses, a nightgown, undergarments, and a hairbrush. At the bottom of her valise lay her most precious possession, a small framed photograph of her parents, both long deceased. She placed it on the chest of drawers, a reminder of happier times. With a deep breath, Madeline straightened her shoulders and stepped back into the kitchen. There was work to be done, and she was determined to prove her worth. By the time the ranch hands began filing in for breakfast, Madeline had prepared a substantial meal of bacon, eggs, and biscuits. She worked efficiently, years of managing her own household serving her well, despite the unfamiliar kitchen. The men were a diverse group, from grizzled veterans to fresh-faced boys barely out of their teens. They regarded her with curiosity, but were uniformly polite, removing their hats and introducing themselves as they entered. Lucas arrived with the last group, his clothes and hands bearing evidence of early morning chores. He nodded approvingly at the spread on the table. "Smells wonderful, Mrs. Nash," he said, taking a seat among his men. Madeline felt an unexpected flush of pleasure at his praise. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott." As she refilled coffee cups and brought out more biscuits, Madeline listened to the men's conversation. They discussed the day's work: fence repairs, cattle that needed moving, a mare about to foal, with the easy camaraderie of men who worked closely together. Lucas was clearly respected, his opinions sought, and his instructions followed without question. He spoke to each man individually, asking about specific tasks or family members, showing a personal interest that Madeline found admirable. The pleasant atmosphere changed abruptly when Vivian Thornton entered the kitchen. Conversation died as the men nodded respectfully in her direction. She was a striking woman in her 30s, her blonde hair arranged in an elaborate style more suited to a city drawing room than a ranch kitchen. Her gaze fell on Madeline, and her lips thinned. "I see you found your way inside, Mrs. Nash." "Good morning, Mrs. Thornton," Madeline replied, determined to remain professional. "Would you care for some breakfast? I'll take coffee in the dining room," Vivian said coldly. "And inform the men that their boots are tracking mud onto my clean floors." Lucas looked up from his plate. "The men have been wiping their boots at the door, Vivian, as they always do. And Mrs. Nash is preparing breakfast for a dozen hungry workers. She can't be serving you separately in the dining room." "I wasn't aware you made the rules regarding household staff, Lucas," Vivian replied, her voice sharp. "And I wasn't aware you'd taken to housing employees in the stable," he countered. A tense silence fell over the kitchen. The ranch hands focused intently on their food, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Albert entered at that moment, his timing unfortunate as always. He sensed the tension immediately and looked between his wife and partner with concern. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, dear," Vivian said, her tone softening for her husband. "I was just explaining to Lucas that I prefer to take my breakfast in the dining room." Albert glanced at Madeline, who was standing awkwardly by the stove. "Mrs. Nash has prepared a wonderful meal here. Why don't we join everyone this morning?" It was a small rebellion, but significant coming from Albert. Vivian's expression tightened, but she conceded with poor grace, taking a seat at the far end of the table. Albert sat beside her after giving Madeline an apologetic smile. The remainder of breakfast passed without incident, though the earlier camaraderie never fully returned. As the men finished eating and headed out to their tasks, Madeline began clearing the table. "Let me help you with that," Lucas said, gathering plates despite Madeline's protests. "It's not necessary, Mr. Prescott. This is my job." "Lucas," he reminded her, "and I was raised to clean up after myself." They worked side by side at the wash basin, Lucas washing while Madeline dried. It was a simple task, but Madeline found herself enjoying the companionship. "Don't let Vivian bother you," Lucas said quietly. "Her bark is worse than her bite." "I've dealt with difficult people before," Madeline assured him. "Though I admit sleeping in the stable was a first." Lucas's expression darkened. "That won't happen again. I've made it clear to Albert." "Thank you, but I don't want to cause problems between the partners." "You're not causing anything. Vivian is." He handed her the last plate. "I should get to work. The men are waiting." As he dried his hands on a towel, he hesitated. "Will you be all right here?" The concern in his voice touched her. "I'll be fine. I have plenty to do." He nodded, seemingly reassured. "I'll see you at noon then. The men come back for dinner midday." After Lucas left, Madeline took a deep breath and surveyed the kitchen. It was clean but disorganized, with pantry items stored haphazardly and cooking implements hanging at random. She would start here, creating order before moving on to the rest of the house. By mid-morning, the kitchen was transformed. Madeline had reorganized the pantry, scrubbed the stove until it gleamed, and arranged the cooking utensils in a more logical fashion. She was sweeping the floor when Vivian appeared in the doorway. "I see you've taken it upon yourself to rearrange my kitchen," she said, her tone accusatory. Madeline straightened, leaning on the broom. "I thought it might be more efficient this way, Mrs. Thornton. If you prefer the previous arrangement, what I prefer is to be consulted before changes are made in my home." Vivian stepped further into the kitchen, her gaze critical as it swept over Madeline's work. "I allowed Albert to hire you because Mrs. Miller spoke highly of your references, despite my reservations about taking in a widow of unknown background." The implication stung, but Madeline maintained her composure. "I assure you, Mrs. Thornton, my only intention is to perform my duties to the best of my ability." "Your duties include following instructions," Vivian countered, "and I don't recall instructing you to reorganize my kitchen." "No, madam, you didn't. See that you remember who is mistress here." Vivian moved to leave, then paused. And I notice you've already ingratiated yourself with Mr. Prescott. I would advise caution in that regard. Before Madeline could respond, Vivian was gone, leaving her confused and unsettled. What had she meant about Lucas? Was she implying something improper? Madeline resumed her sweeping, troubled by the exchange. She had hoped to find peace here, a place to rebuild her life after Thomas's death. Now she wondered if she had simply exchanged one difficult situation for another. The noon meal was a repeat of breakfast, with the men filing in hungry and appreciative of the hearty stew and bread Madeline had prepared. Lucas arrived last, having washed up at the pump outside. His hair was damp and he'd changed into a clean shirt, she noticed. "Something smells delicious," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Just a simple stew," Madeline replied, feeling oddly flustered under his approving gaze. Throughout the meal, she was conscious of Vivian watching her interactions with Lucas. The other woman's eyes narrowed each time Lucas spoke to Madeline or thanked her for refilling his coffee. After the men returned to work, Madeline approached Lucas as he was about to leave the kitchen. "Mr. Prescott, Lucas, may I speak with you for a moment?" He turned back, brow furrowed at her serious tone. "Of course. Is something wrong?" "Not exactly wrong, but—" She glanced around to ensure they were alone. "Mrs. Thornton seems to have taken exception to our friendliness." She made a comment that suggested it was inappropriate. Lucas's expression hardened. "Did she now?" he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Vivian sees threats where none exist. Pay her no mind. I can't afford to antagonize her further. This position is all I have." "You won't lose your position over Vivian's jealousy," Lucas assured her. "This ranch is as much mine as it is Albert's, and I have equal say in who works here." "Jealousy?" Madeline was genuinely puzzled. Why would she be jealous? Lucas hesitated, as if debating how much to reveal. Vivian had expectations when she came here, about the kind of life she would lead, the status she would have. The reality of ranch life has been a disappointment to her. And you represent that disappointment somehow. "I represent the partnership that prevents Albert from selling his share and moving somewhere more to Vivian's liking." His blue eyes met hers directly. "Don't worry about Vivian. Just do your job as you see fit. If there's a problem, come to me." With that, he donned his hat and left, leaving Madeline to ponder the complicated dynamics of the household she'd entered. The afternoon passed quickly, as Madeline turned her attention to the rest of the house. It was a substantial structure, with a formal dining room, parlor, study, and 4 bedrooms upstairs. The furnishings were a curious mix of practical ranch items and more elegant pieces that must have been Vivian's contribution. In the parlor, Madeline paused before the piano Lucas had mentioned. It was a beautiful instrument, well-crafted and obviously valuable. Her fingers itched to touch the keys, but she resisted, focusing instead on dusting and tidying. She was arranging fresh flowers in the dining room when Albert entered, looking uncomfortable as he often did when addressing her directly. "Mrs. Nash, I wanted to apologize again for the misunderstanding about your accommodations." "It's forgotten, Mr. Thornton," Madeline assured him. "And I hope my wife hasn't been difficult. Vivian is used to a certain way of doing things." Madeline chose her words carefully. "Mrs. Thornton has clear preferences about her home. I'm still learning them." Albert nodded, seeming relieved by her diplomatic response. "Good, good. We're pleased to have you here. The house already looks better for your attention." "Thank you, sir," he lingered, apparently wanting to say more but unsure how to proceed. Finally, he spoke again. "Lucas speaks highly of you. He's a good judge of character. Mr. Prescott has been very kind." "He's a good man," Albert said, his tone earnest. "The best partner a fellow could ask for, loyal to a fault. Madeline wasn't sure why Albert was telling her this, but she nodded politely. "Well, I'll let you get back to work," he said, backing toward the door. "Supper at 6 as usual." "Yes, sir. I'll have everything ready." After Albert left, Madeline returned to the kitchen to begin preparations for the evening meal. As she worked, she found herself reflecting on Lucas Prescott. There was something about him that drew her: his directness, his quiet strength, the kindness that seemed so natural to him. It had been a long time since she'd thought of any man in such terms. Her marriage to Thomas had begun with passion but ended in disillusionment. By the time he died, any love she'd felt had been buried under years of broken promises and mounting debts. She pushed these thoughts aside, focusing on the practical task of preparing supper. This was no time for foolish fancies. She was a widow in a precarious position, dependent on this job for survival. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for one of her employers. The following days fell into a routine. Madeline rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, spent her mornings cleaning and organizing the house, cooked the midday meal, and then tackled whatever special projects needed attention in the afternoons. Supper was a smaller affair, usually just for the Thorntons and Lucas, though occasionally one or two of the senior hands would join them. Lucas made a point of speaking with her each day, inquiring about her comfort and whether she needed anything. These brief conversations became the highlight of Madeline's days, though she tried not to show it. Vivian remained cold, issuing instructions with barely concealed disdain, and finding fault with Madeline's work whenever possible. But even she couldn't deny the improvement in the household under Madeline's care. The meals were better, the house cleaner, and everything ran more smoothly. A week after her arrival, Madeline was folding laundry in the kitchen when Lucas entered, looking troubled. "Is something wrong?" she asked, setting aside a stack of napkins. "We've got trouble brewing," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot keeping warm on the stove. "There's been rustling on the North Range. We lost at least 20 head last night. That's terrible. Do you know who's responsible?" Lucas shook his head. "Not for certain, but I have my suspicions. There's a new outfit that moved into the valley last fall, the Bar X. Their foreman is a man named Silas Garrett. He's got a reputation. Have you spoken to the sheriff?" "Sheriff Mills rode out this morning, but without proof, there's little he can do." Lucas sipped his coffee, his expression grim. "We'll have to increase our night patrols. I've already told the men." "Will that be dangerous?" Madeline couldn't help asking, concern evident in her voice. Lucas's expression softened at her worry. "We'll be careful, but I wanted you to know why things might be a bit tense around here for a while." "I appreciate that. Is there anything I can do?" "Just keep doing what you're doing. Having good meals and a clean house to come back to means more to the men than you might realize." He hesitated, then added, "Especially me." The simple admission warmed Madeline more than it should have. "I'm glad to be of help." Lucas finished his coffee and set the cup down. "I should get back. We're checking the rest of the herd today, making sure no more are missing." As he turned to leave, Madeline called after him, "Lucas, be safe." He looked back, a small smile touching his lips. "I will." After he left, Madeline resumed her folding, but her mind was filled with worries. Cattle rustling was a serious matter in this part of the country. Men had been killed over far less. That evening, tension hung over the supper table. Albert was unusually quiet, while Vivian seemed almost pleased by the trouble, as if it confirmed her low opinion of ranch life. "I've always said this valley was too remote," she commented, cutting her roast beef into precise pieces. "Too far from the law to be properly civilized." "Sheriff Mills was here within hours of our sending word," Lucas pointed out. "That's not what I'd call remote." Still, if we were closer to Cheyenne or even Laramie, we'd be ranching different land," Albert interrupted, uncharacteristically firm. "This is Prescott and Thornton land. Our fathers chose it because it's good grazing with reliable water and natural boundaries." Vivian pressed her lips together, clearly displeased by her husband's response. "I'm merely suggesting that there are advantages to being closer to town. For shopping, perhaps," Lucas said dryly. "Not for raising cattle." The conversation shifted to more practical matters: how many men would be needed for night patrols, whether they should hire additional hands temporarily, what precautions to take with the remaining herd. Madeline listened as she served, fascinated by this glimpse into the realities of ranch management. Lucas and Albert clearly knew their business, discussing options with the ease of men who had worked together for years. Later, as Madeline was clearing the dining room table, she overheard Lucas and Albert talking in the study, their voices carrying through the partially open door. "I think we should confront Garrett directly," Lucas was saying. "Let him know we're watching. And if he denies it, or worse, if he's armed for trouble," Albert sounded worried, "then at least we'll know where we stand. Right now, we're just waiting for the next raid." "Let's give the sheriff a chance to investigate first," Albert suggested. "Mills is a good man. If there's evidence, he'll find it. And in the meantime, we lose more cattle." Lucas's frustration was evident. "I don't like sitting back while someone steals what we've worked for." "I don't either, but I don't want bloodshed. Vivian's already talking about selling out and moving to Denver." There was a pause before Lucas responded, his voice quieter. "Is that what you want, Albert, to sell the ranch?" "No, of course not. This land is my heritage, same as yours, but Vivian—" "Vivian married a rancher," Lucas said firmly. "She knew what that meant, did she?" "I'm not sure I made it clear enough what life would be like here." Another pause, longer this time. "If you ever do decide to sell, Albert, I hope you'll give me the chance to buy your share first. You know I would, but it won't come to that. We'll get through this rustling business, and things will settle down." Madeline moved away from the door, not wanting to eavesdrop further, but what she'd heard troubled her. The partnership that seemed so solid had vulnerabilities, and Vivian's discontent was a wedge between the two men. That night, as Madeline prepared for bed in her small room, she found herself praying for the safety of the men patrolling the ranch, especially Lucas. The thought of him out there in the darkness, potentially facing armed rustlers, filled her with dread. She chided herself for these feelings. Lucas Prescott was her employer, nothing more. She had no right to worry about him as if he were. What, her husband, a suitor? The very idea was absurd. Yet as she drifted off to sleep, it was his face she saw, those kind blue eyes, the strong line of his jaw, the way his rare smiles transformed his serious expression. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Madeline rose early as usual, starting the coffee and mixing biscuit dough before the first ranch hands arrived. She was rolling out the dough when the kitchen door opened, admitting Lucas and a blast of chilly air. "Good morning," she said, pleased to see him safe. "How was the night?" "Quiet," he replied, removing his hat and gloves. "Too quiet, maybe, like they knew we'd be watching. At least there was no trouble. This time." He approached the stove, warming his hands over the heat. "But they'll be back. Men like Garrett don't give up easily." Madeline noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "You didn't sleep at all, did you? I'll catch a few hours after breakfast," he said, dismissing her concern. "Something smells wonderful. Just biscuits and bacon, nothing special." "Everything you cook is special, Madeline." The compliment, delivered in his straightforward manner, brought color to her cheeks. "You're too kind. Just honest." He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. "I found something yesterday that made me think of you." From his pocket, he produced a small wildflower, its delicate purple petals somehow uncrushes despite its journey. First prairie crocus of the spring, they're rare this early. Madeline accepted the flower, touched by the simple gesture. It's beautiful, thank you. Their fingers brushed as he handed it to her, sending an unexpected shiver up her arm. Lucas held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken passing between them. The moment was broken by the arrival of the first ranch hands, stomping their boots and calling out greetings. Lucas stepped back, nodding to his men as they entered. Throughout breakfast, Madeline found herself unusually conscious of Lucas's presence. She placed the wildflower in a small glass of water on the windowsill, a splash of color against the morning light. As the days passed, the threat of rustlers remained, but no more cattle disappeared. The extra patrols continued, keeping everyone on edge and exhausting the men who had to maintain their regular duties during the day. Madeline did what she could to help, preparing extra food for the night riders and ensuring the house remained a place of comfort and order. She began to feel truly at home on the rocking P, taking pride in her contribution to the ranch's operation. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Madeline found herself alone in the house. The men were all out working, and Vivian had gone to visit a neighbor's wife, a rare social occasion in this isolated area. After finishing her regular chores, Madeline wandered into the parlor and stood before the piano. No one had played it since her arrival, and she longed to feel the keys beneath her fingers again. Hesitantly, she sat on the bench and lifted the cover. The ivory keys gleamed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. She placed her hands lightly on them, savoring the familiar feel, then began to play. The music filled the quiet house, a Chopin nocturne, melancholy and beautiful. Madeline lost herself in the piece, her fingers remembering what her mind had begun to forget during the months of hardship. So absorbed was she that she didn't hear the front door open, nor the footsteps approaching the parlor. It wasn't until she finished the piece that she became aware of someone standing in the doorway. She turned, startled, to find Lucas watching her, an expression of wonder on his face. "Please don't stop," he said softly. "I haven't heard the piano played like that since my mother was alive." Embarrassed at being caught, Madeline began to rise. "I'm sorry. I should have asked permission." "No, please," Lucas said, stepping into the room. "I told you before, you're welcome to play anytime. I just didn't realize you were so accomplished." "I studied for many years," Madeline explained, settling back onto the bench. "Before I married, I taught music to children in Boston. Will you play something else?" The request was so earnest that Madeline couldn't refuse. She turned back to the keys and began a lighter piece, a Mozart sonata that danced through the room like sunlight. Lucas moved closer, standing beside the piano where he could watch her hands. As she played, Madeline felt his gaze on her face, but rather than making her nervous, it filled her with a strange confidence. When she finished, Lucas was silent for a moment. "That was beautiful," he finally said. "You're full of surprises, Madeline Nash." "Good ones, I hope," she replied with a small smile. "Definitely good." He gestured to the bench. "May I?" Madeline moved over, making room for him. Lucas sat beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "My mother tried to teach me," he said, placing his hands awkwardly on the keys. "But I never had the patience for it. Can you show me something simple?" Madeline guided his fingers to a basic C chord. "Start here. Press down gently." Lucas followed her instruction, producing a resonant chord that hung in the air between them. His hands were large and calloused from years of ranch work, but they moved with surprising grace under her guidance. For the next half hour, Madeline taught him a simple melody, laughing at his mistakes and praising his progress. They sat close together on the bench, her smaller hands occasionally covering his to demonstrate a movement. Neither of them heard the front door open again, nor noticed Vivian standing in the parlor doorway until she spoke. "Well, isn't this cozy?" They turned in unison, Lucas's hands falling from the keys. Madeline immediately stood, smoothing her apron nervously. "Mrs. Thornton, I was just showing Mr. Prescott. I can see what you were showing him," Vivian interrupted, her voice cold. "I didn't realize piano lessons were part of your duties as housekeeper." Lucas remained seated, regarding Vivian with a level gaze. "Madeline was kind enough to indulge my curiosity about the piano. If you have an objection, Vivian, you should direct it to me." "Oh, I have several objections, Lucas, chief among them being the inappropriate familiarity you've established with an employee." Vivian turned her gaze to Madeline. "And you, Mrs. Nash, I believe you have duties in the kitchen, not the parlor." Madeline felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. "Yes, Mrs. Thornton. Excuse me." She hurried from the room, mortified by the encounter. Behind her, she could hear Lucas's voice rising in anger, though she couldn't make out the words. In the kitchen, Madeline busied herself with dinner preparations, trying to calm her racing heart. She felt like a child caught stealing sweets, though she'd done nothing wrong. Playing the piano, teaching Lucas a simple tune, these were innocent activities. Why, then, did she feel so guilty? The answer came to her as she aggressively kneaded bread dough. It wasn't the piano playing that troubled her conscience. It was the feelings that had been growing inside her for Lucas, feelings that were entirely inappropriate for a widow of less than 6 months, and absolutely forbidden for a housekeeper toward her employer. She was still wrestling with these thoughts when Lucas entered the kitchen, his expression thunderous. "Madeline, I want to apologize for Vivian's behavior." "There's no need," she said quickly, keeping her eyes on her work. "Mrs. Thornton was right. I should have been attending to my duties." "Playing the piano isn't a crime," Lucas said, his voice softening as he approached the table where she worked. "And you brought joy into this house with your music. That's worth something." Madeline risked a glance up at him. "Still, perhaps it's best if I stick to my assigned tasks." Lucas frowned. "Has Vivian made you feel unwelcome here?" "No more than from the beginning," Madeline said with a small, sad smile. "I understand her position. I'm an outsider and she's protective of her home." "This is my home too," Lucas reminded her, "and I say you belong here." The simple declaration warmed Madeline in a way she hadn't felt in years, but it also frightened her. The more attached she became to Lucas, to this place, the more it would hurt when it inevitably ended. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a great deal to me." Lucas seemed about to say more when the back door burst open and one of the ranch hands rushed in. "Mr. Prescott, riders coming in fast from the north pasture. Joe's been shot." Lucas was immediately alert. "How bad?" "Shoulder wound. He's conscious but losing blood. The boys are bringing him in now." "Tell Albert," Lucas instructed. "Then ride for the doctor in town." He turned to Madeline. "We'll need hot water and clean cloths. Can you help?" "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "I've had some experience with injuries." Lucas nodded gratefully before hurrying out with the ranch hand. Madeline quickly set water to boil and gathered clean linens from the pantry. Her heart raced with worry, but her movements were calm and efficient. Within minutes, the injured cowboy was carried into the kitchen and laid on the large table. Joe Miller was a young man, barely 20, with a shock of red hair now plastered to his forehead with sweat. His shirt was soaked with blood around his left shoulder. "Madam," he gasped when he saw Madeline. "Sorry about the table." "Don't worry about that now," she soothed, already cutting away his shirt with scissors from her sewing basket. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The wound was a clean shot through the fleshy part of his shoulder, missing bone but bleeding heavily. Madeline pressed a cloth against it to staunch the flow while Lucas held the young man steady. "What happened, Joe?" Lucas asked, his voice gentle but urgent. "Rustlers," Joe managed through gritted teeth. "4 of them. They were driving about a dozen head toward the North Ridge. I spotted them and tried to circle around, but they saw me." He winced as Madeline applied more pressure. "One of them shot before I could even draw my gun." "Did you recognize any of them?" Joe shook his head weakly. "They were wearing bandanas over their faces, but their horses. One had a distinctive blaze, white face with a brown marking like a lightning bolt down the nose." Lucas exchanged a significant look with Albert, who had entered during Joe's explanation. "That's Garrett's horse," Albert said quietly. "No mistaking it." Lucas's expression hardened. "This ends now." "Let's wait for the sheriff," Albert cautioned. "With Joe's testimony." "And how many more men get shot while we wait?" Lucas countered. "No, Albert. I'm riding to the Bar X tonight. This has gone too far." "I'll go with you," Albert said, surprising both Lucas and Madeline. Lucas studied his partner for a moment, then nodded. "We'll take 5 men, no more. I don't want this turning into a war." 6, came a weak voice from the table. Joe tried to sit up, but Madeline gently pushed him back down. "Not you," she said firmly. "You're staying right here until the doctor arrives." "The lady's right, Joe," Lucas agreed. "You've done your part. Rest now." As Madeline continued tending to Joe's wound, she couldn't help the fear growing inside her. Lucas was planning to confront armed men who had already shown they were willing to shoot. The potential for violence was enormous. She wanted to beg him not to go, to wait for the sheriff, to find another way. But she had no right to make such a request. She was just the housekeeper, not his wife or sweetheart. The thought brought a sharp pang to her heart. When had Lucas Prescott become so important to her? And what would she do if something happened to him? The doctor arrived an hour later, confirming Madeline's assessment that the wound, while serious, wasn't life-threatening. He cleaned and bandaged Joe's shoulder properly, administering laudanum for the pain, before instructing that the young man be moved to a proper bed. "You did a fine job with the initial treatment, Mrs. Nash, Doctor," Thompson told her as they watched 2 ranch hands carefully carry Joe upstairs to one of the spare bedrooms. "Kept him from losing too much blood." "I've had some practice," Madeline said, thinking of the times she'd tended Thomas after his drunken falls and fights. "Though gunshot wounds are new to me." "Let's hope they remain rare," the doctor replied grimly. "This valley doesn't need a range war." "Is that what's coming?" Madeline asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since Lucas announced his intention to confront the rustlers. "Doctor." Thompson sighed, packing his instruments back into his bag. "Hard to say. Garrett's a troublemaker, no doubt about it. But Prescott and Thornton are respected in these parts. If anyone can handle this without it escalating, it's them." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they did little to calm Madeline's anxiety. As the doctor left, she began cleaning the kitchen, scrubbing Joe's blood from the table with desperate energy. Lucas found her there as he was preparing to leave, her hands raw from the hot water and lye soap. "Madeline," he said softly, "you don't need to do that now." She looked up, only then realizing how vigorously she'd been scrubbing. "I wanted everything clean before you returned." The unspoken worry hung between them, the possibility that he might not return at all. Lucas stepped closer, gently taking the cloth from her hands. "We'll be back by morning. Albert's a steady hand and the men I've chosen are level-headed." "And Garrett, is he level-headed too?" "No," Lucas admitted, "but he's a businessman in his own way. He'll understand when I explain that stealing from the rocking P has become bad business. And if he doesn't understand," Lucas's expression grew serious. Then we'll make sure he can't hurt anyone else. The implication was clear, and it frightened Madeline even as she recognized its necessity. This was the frontier, where sometimes justice had to be administered directly when the law was too distant or too slow. "Please be careful," she said, unable to keep the plea from her voice. Lucas studied her face for a long moment. Then, in a gesture that took her completely by surprise, he reached out and gently touched her cheek. "I have something to come back for," he said quietly. "Someone." Before Madeline could respond, he withdrew his hand and turned away, leaving her standing in the kitchen with her heart pounding and her cheek burning where his fingers had touched her. The hours after Lucas and Albert left with 4 chosen men were the longest of Madeline's life. She kept herself busy, checking on Joe, preparing food for when the men returned, and cleaning every corner of the kitchen though it was already spotless. Vivian remained in her bedroom, emerging only briefly to inquire about Joe's condition before retreating again. Whether her seclusion was due to worry about Albert or disgust at having bloodstains in her kitchen, Madeline couldn't tell. Night fell, bringing with it a sense of dread that Madeline couldn't shake. She tried to sleep, but found herself returning to the kitchen repeatedly, starting at every sound from outside. It was nearly dawn when she heard horses approaching. She rushed to the window, straining to see in the pre-dawn light. 6 riders, the same number that had left. Relief flooded through her. She had coffee brewing and biscuits in the oven by the time the men entered the kitchen. They looked exhausted but unharmed, their expressions grim but satisfied. Lucas was the last to enter. His eyes found Madeline immediately, and the tension in his face eased slightly at the sight of her. "You're all right," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "We're fine," he assured her. "All of us." Albert slumped into a chair at the table, accepting the coffee Madeline poured for him with a grateful nod. It went as well as could be expected. "What happened?" Madeline asked, setting a plate of biscuits on the table. The men exchanged glances, silently debating how much to share. Finally, Lucas spoke. "We found Garrett and his men at their ranch. They denied everything at first, but when we described the horse with the distinctive blaze, they got nervous. I offered Garrett a choice: leave the territory within 48 hours or face charges for rustling and shooting Joe. And he agreed." Madeline was skeptical. "Not at first," Albert said, rubbing his tired eyes. "There was some discussion." Lucas's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "What Albert means is that Garrett tried to draw on us. Fortunately, our men were faster. No one was killed, but Garrett's nursing a bullet graze on his arm that should remind him to be more careful about who he steals from." "The sheriff arrived just as things were settling down," Albert continued. "Turns out Dr. Thompson sent word to him after treating Joe. With our testimony and the stolen cattle we found in their corral, Garrett had no choice but to accept the terms." "So it's over?" Madeline asked hopefully. "It's over," Lucas confirmed. "Garrett and his men are packing up as we speak, with the sheriff watching to make sure they actually leave." The relief in the kitchen was palpable. The other men talked quietly among themselves, the tension of the past weeks finally dissipating. Madeline busied herself serving food, though her eyes kept returning to Lucas. He looked exhausted, with dark shadows under his eyes and a day's growth of beard shadowing his jaw. Yet to her, he had never looked more handsome. As the men finished eating and drifted off to catch a few hours of sleep before the day's work began, Lucas remained at the table, nursing his coffee. Albert had already gone upstairs to reassure Vivian of his safe return. Finally, they were alone in the kitchen. "You should rest," Madeline told Lucas gently. "You've been up all night." "So have you," he pointed out, studying her face. "Waiting for us to return." She didn't deny it. "I was worried. About all of us or someone in particular." His voice was light, but his eyes were intent on hers. Madeline felt her cheeks warm. "About everyone, of course, but especially you." The admission hung in the air between them, more significant than either of them pretended. Lucas set down his coffee cup and rose from the table. He approached Madeline slowly, as if giving her time to retreat if she wished. But she remained where she was, her heart racing. "Before I left," he said quietly, "I said something to you about having someone to come back for." "I remember." He was standing very close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, smell the leather and pine scent that she'd come to associate with him. "I meant you, Madeline. I know it's too soon. You're still grieving your husband, and I'm your employer, and there are a dozen reasons why I shouldn't be saying this. But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just friendship or concern." Madeline's breath caught in her throat. "Lucas, you don't have to say anything," he continued quickly. "I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that you've become important to me, more important than I ever expected." The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability in his expression, they broke through the barriers Madeline had carefully constructed around her heart since Thomas's death. "My husband," she began hesitantly, "was not a good man. By the end, there was little love left between us. His death was a shock, but my grief has been complicated, guilt, relief, anger, all mixed together." She looked up at Lucas. "But since coming here, since meeting you, I've started to remember what it feels like to care for someone, to trust someone." "Madeline," Lucas said, her name a caress on his lips. "May I?" She nodded, unable to form words as he leaned down, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers in a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then more certain as she responded. It was a brief kiss, sweet and full of promise, but it sent warmth coursing through Madeline's body. When they separated, Lucas kept his face close to hers, his hand coming up to cup her cheek as he had done before leaving. "I've wanted to do that since the day I found you in the stable," he admitted. Madeline smiled, feeling lightheaded with joy and lack of sleep. "I'm glad you waited. I wasn't ready then." "And now?" he asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Now," she said softly, "I think I'm beginning to be." The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the moment. They stepped apart as Vivian entered the kitchen, her sharp eyes taking in their flushed faces and close proximity. "I see you've returned safely," she said to Lucas, her tone cool. "Albert tells me the rustlers have been dealt with." "They have," Lucas confirmed, his voice steady despite the moment she had interrupted. "Garrett and his men will be gone by tomorrow." "Good." Vivian's gaze shifted to Madeline. "Mrs. Nash, I'll take breakfast in the dining room today. And please see that fresh linens are put in the guest room where that injured cowboy is staying." "Yes, Mrs. Thornton," Madeline replied, falling back into her role as housekeeper with practiced ease. Vivian looked between them once more, her expression calculating, before turning and leaving the kitchen. Lucas sighed once she was gone. "I should get some sleep before the day's work begins." "Yes, you should," Madeline agreed, though she was reluctant to see him go. He caught her hand briefly, squeezing it. "We'll talk more later." "I'd like that," she said, returning the pressure of his fingers. As Lucas left, Madeline turned to her duties with a lighter heart than she'd had in months. Whatever lay ahead, and she knew it wouldn't be simple or easy, she felt, for the first time since Thomas's death, that she might have a future worth hoping for. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. With the rustling threat resolved, the ranch returned to its normal rhythms, though everyone remained vigilant in case Garrett or his men tried to cause trouble before leaving the valley. Joe recovered quickly. his youth and vitality serving him well. By the third day, he was up and about, his arm in a sling but his spirits high. He'd become something of a hero among the other hands for his part in identifying the rustlers. Madeline and Lucas found few opportunities to be alone together. Between his duties overseeing the ranch and hers maintaining the household, their interactions were limited to brief moments and meaningful glances across the crowded kitchen at mealtimes. Yet even these small connections sustained Madeline through long days of work. There was a new purpose to her efforts, a sense that she was contributing to something that might, someday, be partly hers. It was a dangerous thought, she knew. Nothing had been promised between them beyond that one sweet kiss. Lucas had expressed feelings for her, yes, but they had not discussed what might come of those feelings. And there were obstacles: her recent widowhood, the difference in their positions, Vivian's obvious disapproval. Still, hope had taken root in Madeline's heart, and she found herself smiling more often, humming as she worked, imagining possibilities that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. A week after the confrontation with Garrett, Madeline was hanging laundry in the backyard when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Shielding her eyes against the spring sunshine, she watched as a buckboard pulled up to the house, driven by a woman she didn't recognize. The visitor was older, perhaps in her 60s, with silver hair neatly pinned beneath a practical bonnet. She handled the reins with confident ease, bringing the wagon to a stop near the kitchen door. "Hello there," the woman called cheerfully. "You must be Mrs. Nash." "I'm Martha Miller, Joe's mother." Madeline approached the wagon with a welcoming smile. "Mrs. Miller, it's a pleasure to meet you. Joe's doing much better. He's probably in the bunkhouse if you'd like to see him." "In a moment, dear. First, I've brought some things for the household. A token of thanks for taking such good care of my boy." She gestured to several baskets in the back of the wagon. "There's preserves and baked goods, and some of my special remedy for pain that Joe swears by." "That's very kind of you," Madeline said, helping the older woman down from the wagon. "Let me help you with those baskets." As they carried the gifts into the kitchen, Mrs. Miller chatted amiably about her journey from her homestead several miles away. "I would have come sooner, but my sister's been ailing, and I couldn't leave her until my niece arrived to help." "Joe understood," Madeline assured her. "He speaks of you often and with great affection." "He's a good boy," Mrs. Miller said proudly. "His father would have been proud of how he's turned out." She paused, looking around the kitchen appraisingly. "You've kept this place up nicely." "It was in a sorry state when I left." Madeline remembered Lucas mentioning that Mrs. Miller had been the previous housekeeper. "You must have been here a long time." 23 years, the older woman confirmed, since Albert and Lucas were boys running wild around the place. "Their mothers were my dearest friends." "You must miss it," Madeline said, arranging the preserves on the pantry shelf. "Parts of it," Mrs. Miller acknowledged. "But at my age, I'm happy to have a smaller place to manage. My cottage is just right for me and my chickens." She studied Madeline thoughtfully. "You're settling in well, I hear. Lucas spoke highly of you when he visited last week to check on my sister." Madeline felt her cheeks warm at the mention of Lucas. "Everyone has been very kind. Well, almost everyone," she amended, thinking of Vivian. Mrs. Miller chuckled knowingly. "Ah, Vivian Thornton hasn't changed then. That woman never did appreciate what she had here. It's not the life she expected, I think. No, she expected to change Albert into something he's not, and the ranch along with him." Mrs. Miller shook her head. "Some people are never satisfied with their blessings." The older woman's words resonated with Madeline. After the hardships she'd endured following Thomas's death, she had learned to appreciate the simple security of a roof over her head and honest work to do. Everything beyond that, the growing feelings between her and Lucas, The sense of belonging she'd found at the Rocking Pea felt like unexpected gifts. "Now," Mrs. Miller said, changing the subject, "where's that son of mine hiding? I want to see this shoulder wound for myself." Madeline led her out to the bunkhouse, where Joe's delighted greeting of his mother brought smiles to everyone present. As she left them to their reunion, Madeline noticed Lucas watching her from the corral, where he'd been working with a young horse. She changed direction, walking toward him with a lightness in her step she couldn't suppress. "Mrs. Miller seems like a remarkable woman," she said as she reached the fence. Lucas smiled, leaning his arms on the top rail. "She is. Practically raised Albert and me after our mothers died. Kept us in line when our fathers were too busy with the ranch to notice what we were up to." "She mentioned you visited her last week," Madeline said, curious about this errand she hadn't known about. Lucas nodded. "I try to check on her regularly. Her sister's been ill, and with Joe working here, I want to make sure she has everything she needs." The simple kindness of this act touched Madeline deeply. It was so characteristic of Lucas, quietly taking care of those he felt responsible for, without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. "You're a good man, Lucas Prescott," she said softly. He looked almost embarrassed by the praise. "I try to be, don't always succeed. More often than not, I'd wager." Their eyes met and held, the connection between them palpable even across the fence. Madeline was acutely aware of the ranch hands working nearby, of Joe and his mother who might emerge from the bunkhouse at any moment, of the possibility of Vivian watching from the house. Yet in that moment, she didn't care who might see the affection in her face. Her feelings for Lucas had grown too strong to hide completely, even if propriety demanded they be discreet. "Madeline," Lucas began, his voice low, "I've been thinking about what happened, about what I said to you after we returned from Garrett's place." "Yes." Her heart quickened at the serious note in his voice. "I meant every word," he continued, "but I realize it puts you in a difficult position working here while we—" he struggled to find the right words. "While we have feelings for each other," Madeline finished for him, surprising herself with her boldness. Lucas nodded, relief crossing his face at her directness. "Yes, exactly. I don't want to compromise your position here or make things uncomfortable for you." "It's a little late for that," she said with a small smile. "I think Mrs. Thornton already suspects. Vivian suspects everyone of everything," Lucas said dryly, "but in this case she's not wrong." The admission sent a thrill through Madeline. "No, she's not." Lucas glanced around, ensuring they weren't being closely observed, then reached across the fence to briefly take her hand. "Ride with me tomorrow. There's a place I'd like to show you, and we could talk more freely there." "I'd like that," Madeline said, squeezing his hand before letting go. "But what about my duties? I think the house can survive without you for one afternoon," Lucas said with a smile. "And if Vivian complains, she can take it up with me." The prospect of time alone with Lucas, away from the watchful eyes of the ranch, was too tempting to resist. "What time?" "After the midday meal. I'll saddle a gentle mare for you." "I'll be ready," she promised, already anticipating the outing with excitement and a touch of nervousness. As she walked back to the house, Madeline was aware of a lightness in her step that hadn't been there in years. For the first time since Thomas's death, perhaps even before she felt truly alive, with something to look forward to beyond the next day's work. The following day dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for a ride. Madeline moved through her morning tasks with barely contained anticipation, earning curious glances from the ranch hands at her unusually cheerful demeanor. After serving the midday meal and cleaning up the kitchen, she changed into her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and pinned her hair more carefully than usual. It was vanity, she knew, but she wanted to look her best for Lucas. He was waiting for her by the corral, 2 horses saddled and ready. One was his own mount, a powerful bay gelding. The other was a gentle-looking dun mare with a white blaze. "This is Daisy," Lucas said, introducing her to the mare. "She's steady as they come. You've ridden before." "A little," Madeline admitted. "It's been some time, though." Lucas helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. The brief contact sent warmth through her despite the layers of clothing between them. "You'll do fine," he assured her, adjusting the stirrups to fit her height. "We'll take it slow." They rode out from the ranch at an easy pace, Lucas leading the way along a well-worn trail that wound through rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers. The spring air was fresh and clean, carrying the scent of sun-warmed earth and new growth. "It's beautiful," Madeline said, taking in the landscape that stretched to distant mountains. "I've been so busy in the house, I haven't had a chance to really see the ranch." "This is just the beginning," Lucas told her with a smile. "Wait until we reach the lookout." They rode for about an hour, climbing gradually higher as the trail followed a creek that bubbled over rocks and through small pools. Madeline quickly regained her confidence in the saddle, especially with Daisy proving to be as steady as promised. Finally, they crested a small ridge, and Lucas reined his horse to a stop. "Here we are." Madeline gasped at the vista before them. From this elevation, they could see the entire valley, the ranch buildings looking tiny in the distance, the patchwork of pastures, the ribbon of the creek winding its way through stands of cottonwood trees. Beyond, the mountains rose in majestic tiers, their peaks still capped with snow. "This is magnificent," she breathed, overwhelmed by the beauty of the land. "My father used to bring me here when I was a boy," Lucas said, dismounting and coming to help her down. "He said a man needs to see his land from a distance now and then, to remember what he's working for." Madeline accepted his assistance, her hands resting on his shoulders as he lifted her from the saddle. This time, he didn't immediately release her once her feet touched the ground. Instead, his hands remained at her waist, his face close to hers. "It's as much about the people as the land, though," he continued softly. "A ranch is nothing without people who care about it and each other." Madeline's heart raced at his nearness, at the meaning behind his words. "Is that why you brought me here, to show me what you're working for?" "Partly," he admitted. "And partly because I wanted to be alone with you, without worrying who might be watching or listening." He released her then, taking the horse's reins and securing them to a nearby tree where they could graze on the abundant grass. Madeline followed him to a flat rock overlooking the valley, where they sat side by side, not quite touching but close enough to feel the warmth of each other's presence. For a while, they simply enjoyed the view in comfortable silence. Then Lucas spoke, his voice thoughtful. "When I found you in the stable that morning, I was angry at Vivian, at Albert for not preventing it, at myself for not being there when you arrived." He turned to look at her. "But I never imagined how important you would become to me in such a short time." "Nor I you," Madeline replied honestly. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. I came west looking for security, not feelings I wasn't prepared for." "Tell me about him," Lucas said gently. "Your husband." Madeline was surprised by the request, but she recognized it as genuine interest rather than jealousy. "Thomas was charming and handsome when I met him, the son of a business associate of my father's. I was young, just 18, and flattered by his attention." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "The first year was good, but Thomas had weaknesses, gambling, drinking. He could never resist a wager, even when we couldn't afford to lose. And he did lose, more often than not." Lucas listened without interrupting, his expression compassionate. By the time he died, we were living in 2 rented rooms and I was teaching piano to support us. The pneumonia took him quickly, which was a mercy, I suppose, but then I discovered just how bad things were. The debts, the promises he'd made. She shook her head. I had to sell everything to satisfy his creditors. Even then, it wasn't enough. I left Boston partly to start fresh, but also to escape the shame of it all. You have nothing to be ashamed of, Lucas said firmly. You weren't responsible for his choices. Wasn't I? I chose him despite my father's warnings. I stayed despite knowing what he was. Madeline looked down at her hands. And when he died, part of me felt relieved. What kind of wife feels relief at her husband's death? A human one, Lucas said, taking her hand in his. Madeline, you endured years of hardship because of his actions. It's natural to feel relief when that burden is lifted, even if it came through tragedy. His understanding, free of judgment, released something in Madeline that she'd been holding tight since Thomas's death. Tears welled in her eyes, not of grief, but of relief at finally being able to speak her truth to someone who didn't condemn her for it. Lucas squeezed her hand gently, giving her a moment to compose herself. When she'd wiped her eyes with her free hand, he spoke again. I want you to know that I understand your hesitation. It's soon after your loss and you're in a vulnerable position. If you need time, or if you decide that what's between us can't go further, I'll respect that. Madeline turned to face him fully. It is soon, she acknowledged. And yes, I am vulnerable in many ways, but Lucas, what I feel for you, it's more real than anything I felt in the last years with Thomas, more honest. Hope brightened his face. Does that mean? It means I want to see where this leads, she said with a small smile. Carefully, discreetly, but honestly. Lucas's answering smile was radiant. That's all I can ask for. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. But Madeline met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise. His hand came up to cradle her face, and she leaned into his touch, savoring the connection between them. When they parted, Lucas kept his face close to hers. I want to court you properly, Madeline Nash, not in secret like we have something to hide. But there are complications, she reminded him. My position at the ranch, Vivian's disapproval, Vivian disapproves of most things that bring joy to others, Lucas said dryly. As for your position, that's easily resolved. You can continue as housekeeper for now, but with the understanding that our relationship exists separately from that arrangement. And Albert, what will he think? Albert will be happy for us once he gets over the surprise. Lucas's expression grew more serious. The real question is what you want, Madeline. Are you ready for people to know about us? She considered the question carefully. There would be talk, certainly. A widow finding a new attachment so soon after her husband's death was bound to raise eyebrows, especially when that attachment was to her employer. But the alternative, hiding their feelings, stealing moments together in secret, seemed dishonest and ultimately harmful to what might grow between them. Yes, she said finally, I'm ready. But perhaps we could begin quietly, not announcing anything but not hiding either. Lucas nodded, understanding her caution. We'll take it at your pace, and if at any point you feel uncomfortable or change your mind, I'll tell you, she promised. But I don't think I will. They stayed at the lookout for another hour, talking of lighter things, their childhoods, their dreams, the books they'd read and places they'd seen. Madeline found herself laughing more than she had in years, drawn to Lucas's dry humor and thoughtful observations. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they reluctantly mounted their horses for the return journey. The ride back to the ranch was as pleasant as the outward trip, though both were aware that they were returning to a more complicated reality than the one they'd temporarily escaped. When they reached the ranch yard, Lucas helped Madeline dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. Several ranch hands were nearby, and Madeline noticed their curious glances, quickly averted when Lucas looked their way. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "It was wonderful." "The first of many, I hope," Lucas replied, his eyes warm with affection. As they led the horses toward the stable, Vivian appeared on the back porch, her expression cold as she observed their return. Madeline tensed, anticipating confrontation, but Lucas placed a reassuring hand briefly on her back. "Let me handle Vivian," he murmured. "Go on inside. I'll see you at supper." Madeline nodded, reluctantly parting from him to enter the kitchen. As she passed Vivian on the porch, she nodded politely but received only a tight-lipped stare in return. Once inside, Madeline quickly set about preparing the evening meal, her mind still filled with the events of the afternoon. She had committed herself to a path that would not be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt she was moving toward something hopeful rather than simply running from pain. The sound of raised voices from outside interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see Lucas and Vivian engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion near the stable. Albert had joined them, his expression concerned as he tried to mediate between his wife and partner. Madeline couldn't hear their words, but the tension in their postures was evident. Vivian gesticulated angrily while Lucas stood with arms crossed, his stance unyielding. Albert moved between them, seemingly trying to calm both parties. Finally, Vivian turned and stormed back toward the house. Madeline quickly resumed her work, not wanting to be caught watching. Moments later, the back door slammed open and Vivian swept into the kitchen, her face flushed with anger. "I suppose you think you're very clever," she said without preamble. Madeline straightened, meeting the other woman's gaze steadily. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Thornton. Don't play innocent with me. I've seen how you've been worming your way into Lucas's good graces. A woman barely cold in her widow's weeds, setting her cap for a man of property." The accusation stung, but Madeline refused to show it. "My relationship with Mr. Prescott is my own concern, Mrs. Thornton, and his." "Your relationship," Vivian laughed harshly. "Is that what you call it? Let me tell you something about Lucas Prescott. He may own half this ranch, but he'll never be more than a common cowboy. If you're looking for security, you're setting your sights too low." "I'm not looking for anything," Madeline replied, her voice level despite her rising anger. "And I would appreciate it if you wouldn't speak of Mr. Prescott that way in my presence." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "So it's like that, is it? Well, enjoy it while it lasts. Lucas has never kept a woman around for long. Once he tires of you, you'll find yourself back where you started with nothing." The kitchen door opened before Madeline could respond, and Albert entered, looking uncomfortable. "Vivian, please. This isn't helping anything." "I'm merely offering Mrs. Nash some friendly advice," Vivian said, her tone suddenly honey-sweet. "Woman to woman." "It doesn't sound friendly to me," Albert said with uncharacteristic firmness, "and it's not our place to interfere in Lucas's personal affairs." "When those affairs involve our housekeeper, it becomes our concern," Vivian countered. "What will people say, Albert? A respectable ranch employing a woman of questionable virtue." "That's enough." Albert's voice rose in rare anger. "Mrs. Nash has conducted herself with perfect propriety since arriving here. I won't have you suggesting otherwise in my house." Vivian looked at her husband in shock, unused to being contradicted by him. Without another word, she turned and left the kitchen, her skirts swishing angrily as she went. Albert sighed heavily once she was gone. "I apologize for my wife's behavior, Mrs. Nash. She doesn't adapt well to change." "There's no need to apologize, Mr. Thornton," Madeline said, though she was grateful for his intervention. "I understand this situation is unexpected." Albert studied her face for a moment. "Lucas is a good man, the best I know. If there's something between you two, well, he deserves happiness. You both do." His simple acceptance brought tears to Madeline's eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. That means a great deal to me." Albert nodded awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with emotional displays. "Yes, well, I should go check on Vivian. Dinner at the usual time." "Yes, sir." "It will be ready." After Albert left, Madeline leaned against the kitchen table, momentarily overwhelmed by the confrontation and its aftermath. Vivian's hostility had been expected, but Albert's support was a surprise and a relief. If one of the ranch owners approved of her relationship with Lucas, her position was not as precarious as she had feared. Still, Vivian's words had planted seeds of doubt. What if Lucas did tire of her? What if the attraction between them was merely a temporary fascination on his part? She would be left not only heartbroken but homeless and jobless as well. Madeline pushed these thoughts aside as she returned to preparing dinner. She was not the naive girl who had rushed into marriage with Thomas based on flattery and false promises. She was a woman who had endured hardship and emerged stronger. And Lucas was not Thomas. She had seen enough of his character to know that. Whatever came next, she would face it with open eyes and a guarded heart. But not so guarded that she would deny herself the chance at happiness when it was finally within reach. The next few weeks brought both joy and challenge for Madeline. True to his word, Lucas began courting her openly, though with the restraint appropriate to her recent widowhood. He joined her for walks after dinner, brought her wildflowers he found on his rides around the ranch, and occasionally played chess with her in the evenings, teaching her the game with patience and good humor. The ranch hands accepted the developing relationship with good-natured ribbing directed at Lucas and respectful courtesy toward Madeline. If they had opinions about the propriety of it, they kept them to themselves. Albert maintained his supportive stance, even going so far as to invite Lucas and Madeline to join him and Vivian in the parlor after dinner, a gesture of inclusion that made Vivian's continued coldness more bearable. Vivian herself remained hostile, though she had ceased making direct accusations after Albert's rebuke. Instead, she expressed her disapproval through pointed silences, dismissive glances, and occasional barbed comments thinly disguised as pleasantries. Through it all, Madeline continued her duties as housekeeper with undiminished diligence. If anything, she worked harder to ensure that Vivian had no legitimate complaints about her performance. The house had never been cleaner, the meals never more carefully prepared. Lucas noticed her efforts and worried that she was overextending herself. "You don't have to prove anything to Vivian," he told her one evening as they sat on the back porch, watching the sunset. "She'll find fault regardless." "I'm not doing it for her," Madeline replied. "I'm doing it for myself. I want to know that whatever happens between us, I fulfilled my obligations honestly." Lucas took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Have I told you today how remarkable you are? Not in those exact words," she said with a smile. "Well, you are." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Remarkable and beautiful and stronger than you know." Such moments of tenderness filled Madeline's days with a happiness she had never expected to find again. Yet she remained cautious, protective of her heart even as she felt it opening more to Lucas with each passing day. It was during one of their evening walks, nearly a month after their ride to the lookout, that Lucas broached a subject they had been circling around. "Madeline," he began as they strolled along the creek that ran behind the ranch buildings, "I've been thinking about the future, our future. Her heart skipped at his words, but she kept her voice steady. "Have you?" "Yes." He stopped walking, turning to face her in the golden light of the setting sun. "I know it hasn't been long since Thomas passed, and I respect that you're still healing from that marriage. But I want you to know that my intentions toward you are serious and honorable." "Lucas, let me finish, please," he said gently. "I'm not asking for any commitments now. I understand you need time, but I want you to know that when you're ready, if you ever are ready, I would be honored to make a life with you, not as employer and housekeeper, but as husband and wife." The words hung in the air between them, not quite a proposal, but a declaration of intent that took Madeline's breath away. "I don't know what to say," she admitted when she found her voice. "You don't have to say anything," Lucas assured her, taking both her hands in his. "Just know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere, and when the time is right, I'll ask you properly." Tears welled in Madeline's eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming emotion. "Lucas, I care for you deeply, more than I thought possible after everything that happened with Thomas. But marriage, it's a step I hadn't let myself consider yet." "I understand," he said, squeezing her hands gently. "And I'll wait, however long you need. I just wanted you to know where I stand." Looking into his earnest blue eyes, Madeline felt the last of her reservations beginning to crumble. This man, with his quiet strength and unwavering integrity, was nothing like Thomas. With Lucas, she could envision a future built on mutual respect and genuine affection, not fleeting passion and empty promises. "Thank you," she said softly, "for being patient with me, for understanding that I need time." "Time is something we have plenty of," Lucas assured her. "This land, this ranch, it's endured for generations. What's a few more months or even years in the grand scheme of things?" His perspective, so grounded in the permanence of the land and the continuity of family, comforted Madeline. Here was a man who thought in terms of decades, not moments. A man who built things to last. As they walked back to the house, hand in hand in the deepening twilight, Madeline felt a sense of peace settle over her. The future remained uncertain in its details, but the general shape of it was becoming clearer, and Lucas Prescott was at its center. Spring gave way to summer, bringing longer days and the intense activity of the ranching season. Lucas and the men were often away from dawn until dusk, moving cattle to summer pastures, repairing fences damaged by winter storms, and preparing for the fall roundup that would determine the ranch's prosperity for the coming year. Despite the demands on his time, Lucas always found moments to spend with Madeline. A quick conversation in the kitchen before breakfast, a shared cup of coffee on the porch after dinner, occasionally a longer outing on Sundays when the pace of ranch work slowed slightly. Their relationship deepened with each passing week, building on shared confidences and growing understanding. Madeline found herself telling Lucas things she had never shared with anyone about her childhood in Boston. Her dreams of becoming a concert pianist before practical considerations led her to teaching. The gradual disillusionment of her marriage to Thomas. In turn, Lucas opened up about his own past, the loss of his mother when he was 12, his sometimes difficult relationship with his father, the responsibility he had felt toward the ranch and its people from a young age. "I never resented it," he told her one Sunday afternoon as they sat by the creek, a simple picnic spread between them. "The ranch was always home, always where I belonged. But sometimes I wondered what it would be like to choose my own path, the way Albert did for a while." "Albert left the ranch?" Madeline asked, surprised. Lucas nodded, stretching his long legs out before him. "For about 5 years after we finished school, he went to Denver, worked for a banker who was a friend of his uncle's. That's where he met Vivian. And you stayed?" "Someone had to," Lucas said simply. My father's health was failing and old Mr. Thornton couldn't manage alone, so I stayed, learned everything I could, prepared to take over someday. "Do you ever regret it?" Madeline asked, genuinely curious. Lucas considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "I've had moments of wondering, of course. But this land, these people, they're part of me in a way I can't explain. I wouldn't trade it for anything." His certainty, his rootedness, was something Madeline both admired and envied. Her own life had been marked by upheaval and adaptation, first to marriage, then to reduced circumstances, then to widowhood and the journey west. The idea of belonging so completely to one place was foreign to her experience but deeply appealing. "What about you?" Lucas asked, turning the question back to her. "Do you miss Boston, the life you had there?" "Parts of it," Madeline admitted. "I miss the music most of all, the concerts, the opera, being surrounded by people who shared that passion." She smiled, remembering. "But I don't miss the society, the constant worry about appearances and connections. And I certainly don't miss the life I had with Thomas at the end." "You still have music," Lucas pointed out. "I hear you playing the piano in the evening sometimes, when you think everyone is occupied elsewhere." Madeline blushed, not realizing he had heard her secret sessions. After the confrontation with Vivian over the piano lesson, she had taken to playing only when she thought the house was empty or its occupants otherwise engaged. "It's not the same as performing or even teaching," she said. "But yes, it's a comfort to still have that connection to music. You should play more openly," Lucas encouraged her. "No one would object. In fact, I think Albert would enjoy it. He used to sit for hours listening to his mother play when we were boys." "And Vivian?" Lucas shrugged. "Vivian will find something to object to regardless. You might as well do what brings you joy." His advice, practical and supportive, reinforced what Madeline was coming to understand about Lucas. He didn't expect her to diminish herself or her interests to please others. Instead, he valued the fullness of who she was, encouraging her to embrace all aspects of her identity. It was a marked contrast to Thomas, who had gradually sought to control and reshape her to suit his needs and social ambitions. With Lucas, Madeline felt not only accepted but celebrated for exactly who she was. This realization, more than any other, helped resolve the lingering doubts in her heart. By the time summer began to wane, giving way to the golden days of early fall, Madeline knew with certainty that what she felt for Lucas was not merely gratitude or infatuation, but a deep and abiding love, one built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine compatibility. The question was no longer whether she could love again after Thomas, but whether she was ready to take the leap of faith that commitment required. And increasingly, the answer seemed to be yes. The annual fall roundup was the busiest time on the Rocking P. For 2 weeks, Lucas, Albert, and all the hands were gone from dawn until well after dark, gathering cattle from the far reaches of the ranch's extensive holdings. They returned each night exhausted, hungry, and often soaked from the frequent autumn rains. Madeline rose to the challenge, preparing hearty meals at odd hours, mending torn clothing, and treating the inevitable minor injuries that came with the physically demanding work. She thrived on being useful, on knowing that her efforts contributed to the success of the operation. Even Vivian seemed to soften slightly during this period, perhaps recognizing that Madeline's presence made her own life easier. While she never became friendly, the sharp edge of her hostility dulled to mere coolness. On the final day of the roundup, with the cattle counted, sorted, and either prepared for market or selected for wintering on the ranch, the men returned earlier than usual. There was a festive atmosphere as they filed into the kitchen for a special dinner. Madeline had prepared roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Lucas caught her alone in the pantry as she was fetching more coffee for the men. "You've been amazing these past weeks," he said, his voice low and intimate. "I don't know how we would have managed without you." "I'm glad to help," Madeline replied, warm with pleasure at his praise. "It feels good to be part of something important." "You're more than part of it," Lucas told her earnestly. "You've become essential to the ranch, to me." Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her briefly but tenderly. "I have something to ask you later," he murmured against her lips. "After dinner." Madeline's heart raced at his words and the promise in his eyes. "I'll be waiting." The meal was a joyous affair, with the men recounting tales of their adventures during the roundup cattle found in unlikely places, near mishaps with ornery steers, the record number of calves counted this year. Albert proposed a toast to a successful season, and even Vivian joined in with unusual graciousness. After dinner, as the hands drifted off to the bunkhouse and Albert and Vivian retired to the parlor, Lucas caught Madeline's eye and nodded toward the back door. She followed him outside, where the first stars were appearing in the deepening blue of the evening sky. "Walk with me," he asked, offering his arm. She took it, and they strolled in comfortable silence toward the creek, their path lit by the rising moon. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke. When they reached the large cottonwood tree that marked their usual stopping place, Lucas turned to face Madeline, taking both her hands in his. "Madeline," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "When I found you in that stable 6 months ago, I had no idea how completely you would change my life. You brought warmth and music and laughter back into a house that had grown cold and silent. You showed strength and dignity in the face of difficulties that would have broken many people, and you opened your heart to me when you had every reason to keep it guarded." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "I love you, simply and completely. And I want to spend the rest of my life showing you what that means." From his pocket, he withdrew a small box. Opening it, he revealed a ring, a simple gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "This was my mother's," he explained. "My father gave it to me before he died, saying it should go to the woman who would be my partner in life and on the land he loved." Lucas knelt before her, still holding the box. "Madeline Nash, will you marry me? Will you make a home with me here, share my days and nights, build a future together on this land?" Tears filled Madeline's eyes as she looked down at this man who had become the center of her world. The answer rose from her heart without hesitation or doubt. "Yes," she said, her voice clear despite her tears. "Yes, Lucas, I will marry you." Joy transformed his face as he rose to his feet. With hands that trembled slightly, he removed the ring from its box and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "I love you," Madeline said, speaking the words aloud for the first time. "I love you, Lucas Prescott." He pulled her into his arms then, kissing her with a passion that had been carefully restrained during their courtship. Madeline responded in kind, her arms circling his neck as she gave herself fully to the embrace. When they finally parted, both breathless, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "You've made me the happiest man in Wyoming territory," he said softly. "Possibly the entire country." Madeline laughed, giddy with happiness. "When shall we marry?" "As soon as you're ready," Lucas replied. "Tomorrow, next month, next spring, whenever you feel it's right." She considered this. While part of her wanted to rush to the altar immediately, she recognized the importance of observing a decent interval since Thomas's death. Not for her own sake, she had made her peace with that chapter of her life, but for the sake of propriety and respect. After Christmas, she decided. When the worst of winter has passed, but before the spring work begins. That gives us time to prepare, and it will be a full year since Thomas died. Lucas nodded, understanding her reasoning. January, then. A new year, a new beginning. Yes. Madeline looked down at the ring glinting in the moonlight. A new beginning. They walked back to the house hand in hand, both knowing that their return as an engaged couple would mark a significant change in the household. Vivian's reaction was predictable, a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Congratulations offered in a voice devoid of warmth. Albert, however, was genuinely pleased. "It's about time," he said, shaking Lucas's hand vigorously. "I was beginning to think you'd never work up the courage to ask her." "You knew?" Madeline asked, surprised. "Lucas asked my blessing weeks ago," Albert revealed with a smile. "As the closest thing he has to family, and as your employer of record. Of course, I said yes immediately." This small detail that Lucas had sought Albert's approval in advance touched Madeline deeply. It showed a respect for tradition, and for the unconventional family structure of the ranch that spoke volumes about his character. The ranch hands were informed the next day, and responded with enthusiastic congratulations. Joe Miller, fully recovered from his wound and now one of the senior hands, organized an impromptu celebration, complete with a fiddle player, and a cake hastily baked by one of the men who had worked as a cook before turning to ranching. Mrs. Miller, when she heard the news during her weekly visit to check on her son, enveloped Madeline in a warm embrace. "I couldn't be happier if he'd chosen my own daughter," she declared. "Lucas deserves a good woman, and you, my dear, deserve a good man." The weeks following the engagement were busy ones. Beyond her regular duties, Madeline now had a wedding to plan, simple though it would be by Eastern standards. There was her dress to consider, invitations to send to the scattered neighbors and friends of the ranch, arrangements to make with the minister in town. Lucas insisted that she no longer needed to work as housekeeper once they were officially engaged. "You'll be mistress of half this ranch," he pointed out. "It's not fitting for you to continue as an employee." But Madeline was firm. "Until we're married, I want to fulfill my obligations. Besides, who would manage the household if I stopped now?" Vivian has shown no interest in taking on those duties. It was true. Despite being the nominal mistress of the ranch, Vivian had always left the practical aspects of household management to others. Since Madeline's arrival, she had retreated even further from such responsibilities. Lucas conceded the point, though he insisted that Madeline accept help from one of the younger ranch wives who lived in a small cabin on the property. Sarah Jenkins was glad for the extra income, and Madeline welcomed the assistance, as wedding preparations added to her workload. As fall deepened toward winter, another change came to the rocking P. Albert, who had been unusually quiet since the engagement announcement, approached Lucas one evening as they sat reviewing the ranch accounts in the study. "I've been thinking," he began hesitantly, "about the future of the ranch." Lucas looked up, immediately alert to the serious note in his partner's voice. "What about it?" "Vivian's not happy here," Albert said, stating what everyone already knew. "She never has been, really. But since you and Madeline, well, it's become harder for her." "I'm sorry for that," Lucas said cautiously, "but I don't see how my marrying Madeline affects Vivian's feelings about ranch life." Albert sighed, rubbing his forehead wearily. "It's complicated. I think seeing you find happiness here makes her more aware of her own unhappiness. And the thought of sharing the house with another woman who loves the ranch, who fits in where she never has." "What are you saying, Albert?" Lucas asked directly. "Are you thinking of selling your share?" "Not exactly," Albert replied. "But Vivian's sister has written from Denver. Her husband's business is expanding and he's looking for a partner. It would mean moving to the city, having the kind of life Vivian has always wanted. Lucas was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this news. "And what do you want, Albert? Not Vivian, you." "I want my wife to be happy," Albert said simply. "And I'm tired of being caught between her and the ranch, between her expectations and reality." "So you would leave, just like that?" There was hurt in Lucas's voice, though he tried to hide it. "No, not just like that," Albert assured him. "I wouldn't leave you in the lurch. What I'm proposing is a gradual transition. I'd keep my ownership share, at least for now, but make you managing partner with full authority to run the operation as you see fit. I'd visit regularly to review the books, make major decisions together, but the day-to-day would be yours entirely." It was a significant offer, giving Lucas what he had always wanted: complete control over the ranch's operations while allowing Albert to pursue a life that might finally satisfy Vivian. "And the house?" Lucas asked. "Would you keep your rooms here?" "For visits, yes. But we'd make our primary residence in Denver." Albert hesitated, then added, "It would be your home, Lucas, yours and Madeline's, as it should be." The implications of this arrangement settled over Lucas. He and Madeline would have the large house to themselves, space to start a family, freedom from Vivian's constant disapproval. The ranch would effectively be his to manage according to his own vision, though Albert would retain financial interest. "Have you discussed this with Vivian?" he asked. Albert nodded. "She's more than ready to go. In fact, she'd prefer to leave immediately, but I've convinced her to wait until after your wedding. It would be unfair to disrupt everything now." "And you're sure this is what you want?" Lucas pressed, concerned for his oldest friend. "Not just what Vivian wants. I'm sure," Albert said with surprising firmness. "I've spent 15 years trying to make Vivian happy here and 15 years failing. Maybe it's time to try something different." There was a wisdom in Albert's words that Lucas had to respect. And perhaps it was for the best. The tension between Vivian and Madeline, though mostly unspoken now, remained a constant undercurrent in the household. With Vivian gone, Madeline could fully assume her role as mistress of the ranch without navigating that difficult relationship. "All right," Lucas said finally. "If this is what you want, I'll support it. We'll work out the details after the wedding." "Thank you," Albert said, relief evident in his voice. "I was afraid you'd be angry." "Disappointed, maybe," Lucas admitted, "but not angry. I want you to be happy too, Albert. And if that means making a life in Denver with Vivian, so be it." The two men shook hands, sealing the agreement that would change the future of the Rocking P. When Lucas told Madeline about the conversation later that night as they sat on the porch despite the November chill, she listened thoughtfully. "Are you all right with this?" she asked when he had finished explaining. "I think so," Lucas said, considering. "It's not what I expected, but it might be for the best. The ranch will still be Prescott and Thornton land, just managed differently, and it means we'll have the house to ourselves." "I'm sorry for Albert," Madeline said softly. "It can't be easy, being torn between loyalty to the ranch and love for his wife." "No, it can't," Lucas agreed. "But I think he's making the right choice for himself, finally. And who knows? Maybe Vivian will be happier in Denver and that will make their marriage stronger." "I hope so," Madeline said sincerely. Despite Vivian's treatment of her, she wouldn't wish unhappiness on anyone. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching their breath form clouds in the cold air. Then Lucas spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "This changes things for us too, you know. With Albert and Vivian gone, there will be more responsibility on my shoulders. On our shoulders," he corrected himself. "I'm not afraid of responsibility," Madeline assured him. "And I'll be by your side whatever comes." Lucas turned to her, his expression serious in the dim light from the kitchen window. Do you ever regret saying yes, committing to this life, so different from what you knew in Boston? Madeline considered the question honestly. The ranch was isolated, the work demanding, the luxuries she had once taken for granted now rare indulgences. Yet in the months since her arrival, she had found purpose, community, and love, things that had been missing from her life in Boston, especially in the later years of her marriage. "No," she said firmly. "I don't regret it for a moment. This place, these people, they've become home to me in a way Boston never truly was. And you, Lucas, you've given me back my belief in the possibility of happiness." He took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I want to give you everything, Madeline, everything I have, everything I am." "You already have," she replied softly. "Love is enough, the rest is just details." As winter descended on the valley, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine wonderland, preparations for the wedding continued. Madeline's dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk, hung in her room, a tangible reminder of the future that awaited her. Christmas came and went, celebrated with a warmth and joy that made even Vivian unbend slightly. She had been more pleasant since the decision to move to Denver, as if the prospect of escape had lifted a weight from her shoulders. Finally, on a clear, cold day in mid-January, Lucas and Madeline were married in the small church in town. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by the entire ranch staff, neighboring ranchers and their families, and a few friends from town. As they exchanged vows, Madeline looked into Lucas's eyes and saw there all the love and commitment she had ever hoped for. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Lucas's lips met hers in their first kiss as a married couple, she felt a sense of homecoming more profound than any she had ever experienced. The celebration afterward, held at the ranch, lasted well into the night. There was music and dancing, food and drink, laughter and tears of joy. Madeline moved through it all in a happy daze, scarcely able to believe that this was her life now, that the lonely widow who had once been forced to sleep in a stable was now mistress of the rocking P, beloved wife of Lucas Prescott. When the last guest had departed and the house was quiet, Lucas led her upstairs to the master bedroom, his room, now theirs. He had moved her few possessions earlier in the day, arranging them carefully alongside his own. "Welcome home, Mrs. Prescott," he said softly, closing the door behind them. Madeline turned to him, her heart full to overflowing. "Home," she repeated, savoring the word. "Yes, this is home now. You are home." As Lucas took her in his arms, Madeline knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged. Not in a place, though the ranch had become dear to her, but in the love of this good man who had seen her worth when she was at her lowest. From that cold morning in the stable to this warm night in their shared bedroom, the journey had been one of healing and discovery. And now, as husband and wife, they would continue that journey together, building a life as enduring as the land that had brought them together. 1 year later, on a bright spring morning much like the one when Madeline had first arrived at the Rocking P, she sat on the front porch, cradling her infant daughter in her arms. The baby, Catherine Elizabeth Prescott, born just 2 months earlier, slept peacefully, unaware of the legacy she represented as the newest generation on the ranch. Lucas emerged from the barn, spotting his wife and daughter on the porch. His face, tanned from long days working outdoors, broke into a smile that still made Madeline's heart race. He crossed the yard with long strides, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. "How are my girls this morning?" he asked, bending to kiss Madeline before gently touching his daughter's cheek. "Perfect," Madeline replied, leaning into his embrace. "Just perfect." Albert and Vivian had moved to Denver shortly after the wedding, though they returned periodically for visits. To everyone's surprise, Vivian seemed genuinely happy in the city, and her improved mood had a positive effect on her relationship with Albert. They were expecting their first child in the fall, a development that had brought the two couples closer despite the distance between them. The ranch prospered under Lucas's sole management, with Madeline proving to be an astute partner in the business as well as in life. Her organizational skills and education complemented Lucas's practical knowledge of ranching, and together they had implemented changes that increased efficiency and profitability. Mrs. Miller visited regularly, doting on baby Catherine and offering Madeline the motherly guidance she had long been without. The older woman had become family in all but name, her wisdom and warmth a blessing Madeline cherished. "I was thinking," Lucas said, settling beside her on the porch swing, "about expanding the house. Adding a music room for you, a proper nursery for Catherine, maybe a few more bedrooms for the children we might have in the future." Madeline smiled at the thought. "I'd like that. This house should be filled with children and music." "And love," Lucas added, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Always love." "Always," Madeline agreed, looking out over the ranch that had become her home. From the flowering meadows to the distant mountains, from the busy barns to the peaceful creek, every inch of it was now woven into the fabric of her life. The stable where she had spent her first night, cold and despairing, still stood across the yard. But it was no longer a place of hardship in her memory. Instead, it had become the starting point of the journey that led her to Lucas, to Catherine, to the fullness of life she now enjoyed. "I was thinking about that first morning," she said, following her thoughts. "When you found me in the stable and brought me inside. Do you remember what you said to me?" Lucas smiled, remembering. "I said this is your home too." "You couldn't have known then how true those words would become," Madeline said softly. "Maybe I did in some way," Lucas mused. "Something about you, even then, felt right, like you belonged here." Madeline leaned her head against his shoulder, content in a way she had never thought possible during those dark days after Thomas's death. "I do belong here," she said with quiet certainty. "With you, with our daughter, on this land. This is where I was always meant to be." As the spring breeze carried the scent of new growth and promise across the porch, Madeline Nash Prescott closed her eyes in gratitude. The widow who had once been forced to sleep in a stable had found not just shelter, but love, purpose, and a true home in the arms of the cowboy who had seen her worth from the very beginning.